afternoon. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar, WannaCry Threat Intelligence Briefing. I'm Brianne from HIS Talk, and I'll be moderating. I have a couple of housekeeping items to make you aware of before we start the webinar. Attendee phone lines have been muted to prevent background noise. Please use GoToWebinar's question box in the console to submit questions to our presenter at any time. The presenter will answer your questions during Q&A at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you will receive links to the recording as well as a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation in a follow-up email. Our speaker today is John Gomez. John is the CEO of Sensato and a healthcare-focused cybersecurity researcher. With that, I will turn it over to you, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for taking time to join us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are currently. We're going to dive into this rather quickly, but before we do, just a brief disclaimer. As you can imagine with any information of this nature, the information is changing, and therefore we ask that any actions or suggestions that you take away from this, that you vet that against your own situations and understand that the briefing is for informational purposes only. So with that, let's go ahead and get started and talk a little bit about the threat evaluation cycle. We're only going to bring this up simply because we want to make sure that you understand how we've come up with the threat information that we're providing to you today. Typically, the way that we work as an organization is we have about 8,000 sensors across 120 countries. We also have partnerships with private and government-based peers that provide us information regarding threat intelligence. We then analyze those threats and try to gather as much intelligence as possible before we get into the act of processing that intelligence. Once we process the intelligence, we move into a phase for analysis and production of that information, which is where we spend a lot of time attempting to validate not only what we're seeing, but what we're being told and what's actually being broadcast across the waves. That then brings us to the dissemination phase when we share that intelligence, very much like what we're doing today. Ultimately, we try to make some projections in terms of where we feel this threat will go or what we can see some of the ramifications becoming of this, and we'll speak about that today. And then ultimately, as part of any good process, we review our actions and attempt to be better at what we do the next time around. So that's type of the threat intelligence cycle that we go through. It's a rigorous process, and so some of the information we provide you today may be things that you have not heard before. Hopefully, we'll clarify things that you may have heard in the media or from other sources. Again, we try to be as factual as we can, but as is stated in the disclaimer, ultimately we entrust that you will make your own decisions, not only based on what we're telling you, but also what other information you may hear. If you do believe that there's something that we present that is not the latest or that you have other sources giving you different and conflicting information, let us know and we'll evaluate that, and if need be, update the information. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about where we are with WannaCry, what it is, and how it kind of the effect it's had. First and foremost, as we all know, this is a ransomware attack, and it's also known by a variety of other names, one of which being WannaCrypt 2.0. In any case, it all comes back to the same attacker's code base, and the ultimate goal of it is to do a ransomware attack. We know that on Friday morning, May 12th, the first attack was actually against Telefonica, a telecommunications provider in Spain. And then from there, the attack spread. What's still unknown really is if the attack spread through Telefonica across the internet, or if the attack was multifaceted, meaning that there were actually multiple points of attack, and Telefonica just happened to be the first one that realized that they were under attack. In either case, the attack did spread across the internet, ultimately attacking and infecting about 105 countries and 205,000 computers. As of 9:45 this morning, that's the latest tallies we have. There's some discrepancy in the amount of countries that have been attacked. Some of the lower numbers say it's only been 76, and some of the higher numbers are about 106. In either case, we feel that as of this morning, saying that about 105 countries and 200+ thousand computers is a safe number. We don't see a dramatic outcome that's different if those numbers were to shift one way or the other. The one big piece that for the people on this call I think is really important for you to understand is that this is not a healthcare attack, at least not on the intelligence we've seen and the sources that we've spoken to. We believe in the early hours of the attack, it was believed that this was a targeted attack because of the information coming out of the UK and NHS. And although NHS did suffer from this attack as a single entity, and possibly in a much more concentrated fashion comparative to any other industry, there is nothing that really says these attackers were specifically going after healthcare. We know that organizations like FedEx in Europe, the Russian ministry, banks, and other organizations were compromised from the same attack at the same time that NHS dealt with the attack that they saw. Now, the question that has come up is, well, if it wasn't a focused healthcare attack, then why did NHS see so many of their systems breached? And unfortunately, there's a very simple answer to that when you get down below the hype and really start looking at things in context, kind of applying that threat intelligence cycle we talked about. If you think about NHS over the past year to 18 months, one of the things that's very apparent is that they've had budget cuts around IT. The belief right now is that due to those budget cuts, they also were not able to update a lot of their hardware and also did not have good patch management in place. Now, all of that together kind of created a situation that when one of the NHS instances got breached, it then found its way to the other ones. And ultimately, it appeared to be an attack against healthcare, but honestly, it was just lack of patch management and probably challenges due to budget constraints that led to them having a significant population or sectoral population affected by this. But that's kind of where we are in terms of why did it happen and ultimately whether or not this was a targeted healthcare attack. The effect on the U.S. entities, we do know that there are U.S. entities that have been attacked or have been breached, but we have not seen clear indications of exactly who that is. So we can't sit here today and tell you it was these 3 or 4 agencies, at least not from our threat intelligence and our requirement to validate information before we're able to disseminate. As I stated, the attack did spread via the internet, and it has been halted. We'll speak a little bit more about that and how that occurred and exactly what that may mean to you. But one of the things we're trying to hopefully have you take away today is that although this attack was an internet-based attack, there are 2 things to keep in mind. One, this is not the first ransomware attack we've seen that has propagated via the internet. We have seen them in 2016. There's an entire code base that is using ransomware through the internet. In fact, there's at least 4 or 5 healthcare institutes in the United States that were affected by that in 2016. We also know that this exact attack can be propagated through phishing campaigns. So one of the things you'll see in our recommendations is although you need to take steps and hopefully have by now to secure your network, you do also need to make sure that your users understand that they could certainly propagate this attack and the outcome would be the same. The attack, as you may know by now, exploits a known vulnerability in Windows that can actually easily be patched or remediated, and does rely on an NSA toolkit. We're going to dive down into the NSA toolkit in just a little bit to give you a little bit better understanding of how that works and the implications that we'll have for you in the future. There is news out that there are variants of this attack, that it's continuing. We have not seen anything confirmed. There is one piece of confirmed information that I'll share with you in a little bit that is relevant to this, but we have not seen anybody actually have variants of this in the wild. At least not in a confirmed manner where we can say, yes, that's definitely occurring. And that piece of information is important for us to understand because it kind of also speaks to the maturity of the attackers and their motivation, which we'll talk a little bit about. So the attacks were stopped as a little bit after midnight on the East Coast on the 13th. But we do expect new attacks, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in our threat forecast. It currently is unknown who actually is behind the attacks, and although there's been a lot of speculation that the attack is carried out by the shadow brokers, which we'll speak about in a little bit, which is a kind of a cyber espionage group or cyber hacking group. We don't see anything that clearly attributes the shadow brokers to being responsible for this attack. They did have a hand in helping to possibly allow the opportunity for the attack to take place, but we don't see any clear attribution. There's been some media this morning that North Korea is behind the attack. Certainly North Korea and some other groups have the sophistication to do this, but as you'll notice in a few slides, this isn't really as sophisticated as an attack as many may believe it to be. So whether it was North Korea or Iran or who knows what, the reality of this is there is no clear attribution. Our suspicion is that attribution will take some time before, if ever, somebody can point to someone and say they were the ones that did this. So with that, one of the other things that also comes up in attribution is motivation. Everything that's pointing that we're seeing in terms of the motivation for the attack was purely and simply financially driven. We don't see this as having reason for nation states to carry out this type of an attack. Obviously, ransomware could be a very powerful weapon, but to ask for money on top of it and such a small amount of money, and then threaten to double the amount in a few days if you don't pay up, really points more to a cyber crime group than a nation state or terrorist group. So in any case, the point is nobody really has any feeling, no real evidence on attribution at this point. So with this, we thought this was interesting. This comes to us from Kaspersky, and it really shows the kind of distribution of the attacks by country. And in this snapshot, all it is the first top 20. Now, the reason I bring this up is that when we first got alerted to this attack, and there was a lot of discussion about this in the media, it would have made you believe that the UK and some other countries were really at the top of the list, especially if you heard about the NHS stuff. Honestly, the UK is not even in the top 20 of countries that suffered from this attack. Most of the countries that suffered actually fit the profile of what I told you, that by having kind of inadequate IT infrastructure in place and inadequate controls, they fell victim to this. The largest by far is Russia. As much as we may feel that Russia has technical superiority in some other areas, their core IT infrastructure actually is lacking and very dated. So we're not surprised to see that, nor are surprised to see that in Ukraine or India or some of these other countries. But as you can see, the United States, Canada, some of the other countries that you may have heard about in the media are not even in the top 20. Hopefully to hear the reason for this that we're trying to present it to you is to give you a little bit of perspective, and also in a go-forward manner to really think about what you're hearing and what's coming over the wire versus what the reality may be in terms of these types of attacks. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about technical threat analysis. So we're going to shift from kind of what we know about it to a little bit about, or more about how we did this. And this will get a little technical. I'll do my utmost best to keep it high level, and we have a very mixed crowd listening to this. And so we'll do our best to do that, to keep it high level. If there's something you wish to go deeper in or that I confused you with, I'm happy to address that during the Q&A. So we all know, or should know at this point, that this attack exploits a SMB vulnerability within the Microsoft stack, which is patched. But how does it do that? So one of the techniques used is it crafts network packets. And the reason I put this in there, those network packets being crafted, allow the attacker to do remote code execution. Now, the part that is important here for you to understand is this is not new. We've been able to use, as an attacker, I've been able to do this, and other attackers can do this, can craft network packets rather easily. And we've seen this successfully used against firewalls, to breach firewalls. In fact, to this day, we use it to get around firewalls doing some pen testing. We've seen it used to bypass intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems and a variety of other controls that you may have in place, as well as other types of network devices. So the point of that is, although this seemed like a very sophisticated, high-level attack, and we've got the NSA tied to it, ultimately the reality is that any attackers that wanted to put in the time could have probably replicated this attack without any of the support from what shadow brokers did or the NSA toolkit or anything of that nature. And in fact, Microsoft attempted to close this down before it became widely known as an attack vector. But we'll talk a little bit about what did the NSA toolkit provide in this situation, and really what, at the end of the day, what we expect to come from that. So this is not a new technique. It's moderately advanced, but not completely an advanced technique. The way it works is it targets machines across the internet, so public-facing machines that may have port 139 and 445 open, which is where SMB and remote desktop protocols live. If it sees it, it'll attempt to exploit those ports. And obviously, if you don't have the patch or you don't block inbound traffic from those ports, you would have an issue. At that moment, once it determines that those ports are available, the next thing the attack will do is fingerprint the operating system, make sure it's Microsoft, and then attempt to determine the patch level. If all those things line up, the attacker will be successful and exploit the system, and that's what we saw on Friday. One thing of note here to take away for yourselves is that this is a modular-based code design. We have been able to see the code, and it is a very modular, elegant design. Now, what that means is that the attackers are able to rapidly swap out the payload and find different ways to use this attack for different purposes. So that's always a scary thing when they design their code well, because it allows them to efficiently elevate their attack or elevate their design. It does rely on Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue is part of that NSA toolkit. I'll talk more about that in a few moments and give you kind of some insights into how that toolkit works, what you can expect from it, and some of the challenges with it. There's been some different discussions on whether this is using 2048 or other styles of encryption when it does the encryption. In either case, the encryption is a strong encryption, and it's not something that will be decrypted rather easily. We don't know of a valid decryption tool. We know there are certain groups working on a decryption tool, and hopefully they will have that out in the next few days to a couple of weeks. So that's good news, but it's going to take them some time to figure out how to decrypt. The exploit itself is performed in memory. Now, the reason I point that out is for those that don't know, whenever there's a memory-based exploit, it allows the exploit to bypass antivirus. As an attacker, whenever we're trying to get past your antivirus systems, one of the techniques we'll use is to have it live in memory, because typically antivirus is not scanning at an aggressive enough manner your RAM. And so that's one technique we can use. Thankfully, it's not an easy thing to do, so you don't see a lot of in-memory exploits that get past your antivirus. So that's kind of a high-level snapshot of what it is, how it works. And so we're going to dig a little bit deeper and give you some more insights into how this works so you can start thinking about countermeasures or what you're up against in this. So there's an initial attack that takes place. When that happens, we're going to get a little technical. A file by the name of mssec service is dropped, and that bootstraps the attack. When that happens, that file will, so this basically comes in through the channel established over the exploit, those crafted network packets. This file is dropped, and then it executes another file, basically launches another file called tsksche. Now, tsksche, one of the very first things that it'll do is confirm that it should continue the attack. And it does this by going out to the internet and looking for a certain domain. And so we'll talk a little more about that because this is kind of where that kill switch thing comes in. But basically what it's doing is going out and looking for confirmation that the attack should continue. If the answer comes back that yes, your attack should continue, tsksche then does a bunch of other things. It creates a file called mssec v2, and that then relaunches mssec, which I'm not going to get deep into, but it creates a new entry point, which is a technique that we often use when we're trying to bypass security in systems. Basically, at the end of the day, the next set of operations is what most security defenders are concerned about. One of the things that happens is it starts to catalog the subnet to attempt to find other machines on your internal network. Remember, this is all occurring within your network at this point because it's breached that external-facing port 139 or 445. At this point, it's looking for other machines on your network that may have 445 exposed. If it does, it's going to just keep repeating this chain over and over across all those machines and just keep escalating the attack. So this is kind of once it's in, and if you wonder, well, how's it spreading? It's basically doing this. It's just looking for other SMB machines. One thing that's important to keep in mind here is a lot of you may have patched your external-facing machines. In a few moments when we talk about the NSA toolkit, you'll need to kind of reconsider whether or not you should be patching your internal-facing SMB-based machines that may have SMB running on them, or just disable that service altogether. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about what this tsksche app or executable does. It actually is the heart and brains of the system, and it will help you get a few more, a better feeling for how this works and what it actually can do. So the first thing it does is it actually looks for what local drives are available on the machine it's running and what network drives it has. Now, although it's attempting to propagate itself across the network, it's also trying to see what else it can reach from the machine it's on. So it's kind of a double whammy, if you will. On one hand, it's spreading itself. On the other hand, it's not going to wait to see how far it can get. It's going to start looking to get to your files immediately. Second thing it's doing while it's doing that is as it finds folders on your network, it's going to catalog common file types and encryption. Now, one of the things I'll bring up to you guys that we find a lot when we're doing pen tests, especially internal pen tests, is that many of you are running Citrix. And so we find this a lot where people think people are sandboxed in Citrix, so they kind of get a little, I don't want to say lazy or not up to date on their network controls, network access controls. So if you haven't done an internal pen test in a long time or traversed your own network to see to what people can get to with a standard user account, it's a good practice. You got to remember that tsksche is not looking to escalate privileges. It's just using whatever account it can get to. And all too often, we find that the local user account can get to a tremendous amount of network file shares folders and files. So just something to keep in mind. This isn't, again, this really great, cool kind of advanced attack. Now here's something that's interesting, and again, we advise people to close, to prevent Tor from being on your network. We always get pushback that some doctor needs to do some kind of research on the dark web. Not sure why, but we hear it all the time. Task Schedule will deploy Tor, and it brings its own copy. There's 9 files that it deploys to do Tor. A lot of ransomware does this, so Tor traffic is a bad thing for you. We'll talk more of that in a moment. It also then deploys 2 other files. One begins to delete and clean up after itself, and the second one displays the user interface message saying, guess what, your files have been encrypted. We'll take a look at that in a moment as well. And then it connects to Tor. So this is why we tell you to kind of block outbound traffic to Tor, as well as block the use of Tor as an application within your network. The reason it connects to Tor is that it's going to use Tor to anonymize its communication so that the attackers can not be identified. And so it's a rather sophisticated little thing, but it's only using standard tools. It's not like these guys wrote their own super squirrel kind of communication channel. And the takeaway here is that, you know, basic security practices can help kind of prevent some of this for you. And then lastly, it's going to delete some shadow copies. Now, along those lines of basic security practices, especially if you're running Citrix or some type of sandbox environment and you believe that people can't get out of the sandbox, which in many cases they can, and you don't have to be that sophisticated to do so, these are the processes that are running in the background that Task Schedule is relying upon. So when it's deleting the shadow copies and doing those things, it's just using command.exe or some of the other standard tools that are on the Windows environment. Again, we recommend that you prevent users from executing the command.exe or command prompt. And we know that in some cases that creates some challenges and you may need the command prompt, but you really should think about this at a granular level and decide, does everybody really need it, and kind of reduce that footprint if possible. It also uses attrib.exe. For those of you that are as old as I am and you remember back to your DOS days, all this is doing is allowing you to change the file attributes. And what they can do with this is start to hide files and hide or look for files that are hidden and unhide them. This ICALCS application is just simply allows for you to change your access control list. And what's interesting is these guys aren't looking to escalate privileges. They're just using this tool to reconfigure the access control list on your files and other file objects, and that gives them the ability to start encrypting and taking ownership of those files. So again, it's a rather elegant attack, but it's not using things that anybody investing a little bit of time doesn't really understand if you're an attacker. And many network and system administrators, as you're hearing this, are probably thinking, yeah, wow, that's pretty straightforward, no magic. The last thing it does is utilizing IPC, which is your inter-process communication, to move laterally without requiring networks. And this is kind of where the heart of SMB and RDP exists, right? Whenever you have an RDP session, it's going through an inter-process communication layer, and the authentication isn't as good as it can be, so that's why we always tell you to shut down RDP. And so it's just taking advantage of that. Again, not a lot of magic here. So hopefully it's not taking too much wind out of people's sails, but it's a pretty straightforward set of attacks under the covers. The kill switch that you may have heard about is basically this snippet of code here from inside of the WannaCry product. What you're basically seeing is that to the right you'll see http://www and then a bunch of letters. Those letters are basically done with the top 2 rows of your keyboard. Somebody just randomly typed them. And the way it works is basically this chunk of code is looking for to connect to that URL. Now if the URL is found, it will then quit. It just exits. None of the stuff I talked to you about earlier will continue. Now, if it doesn't find that URL out in the world, it continues the attack, and you'll see there's sub_408090 is the subroutine that will be executed from this chunk of code. Now, what's interesting here is that in doing this, we're not really sure if this is a kill switch that the attackers put in place so that if they saw their code wasn't doing what they wanted, they could stop the attack, or if they were employing a little bit more, kind of advanced technique, I'll say advanced, I guess, that when code runs within a sandbox, whatever that sandbox may be, you often will get back a false positive response when you try to reach out to the internet for a variety of reasons. And so one of the techniques that attackers will use is attempt to go out to a website that doesn't exist. And then if you get back a false positive, meaning that you actually reach that website, then you know you're in a sandbox. So you quit, and then you go try your attack on some other machine. So we're not real sure, unless we interviewed the attackers, as to what their thinking was. Either way, we know that when Darian Huss, the person that discovered this, registered that domain, the attack stopped. There's a lot of stuff in the media that Darian was lucky or it was a lucky break. None of that's true. Darian is an extremely talented cybersecurity researcher. What he did was actually brilliant, and it wasn't luck. He was doing his job. It's what he does all the time. He's referred in some cases as a blogger, and he's much more than a blogger. So I want to take pause to kind of give him the credit due, because he did his job, and that was a very powerful thing that he found, because he was on top of his game. So the question now becomes, well, can't the attackers just take that code out and reestablish the attacks? And yes, they can. And this is some screenshots of where the code has been taken out. It's being confirmed that this is actually a strand of the code and actually part of that attack. Nobody's really sure. We think that it's just somebody else who was playing around with the code and decided to see what would happen if they took the kill switch out. So in any case, yes, the attackers could remove that switch, and the attacks would then continue to be propagated. And at that point, from what we know right now, the only real defense would be that your systems are patched and hardened correctly. This is the UI. If you haven't seen it already, it provides you instructions. If you do get attacked, a payment countdown clock telling you how long before they're going to raise the ransom on you. A deletion clock, which tells you how long before they're going to permanently get rid of your files. Remember, they've set the attributes on those files, so they basically own them at this point. They have very helpful product support. You can contact them anonymously, obviously, through that Tor channel. And in many cases, maybe you can negotiate the ransom. You can also ask for other feedback and things like that. But, they actually thought through this. So this is part of the intelligence where we look at how this was constructed. And if they didn't really want their money, we don't think they'd be so helpful. There's no reason for a nation state to go to this trouble if they're just attempting to kind of make a statement. There's no need for them to staff a help desk if all they're trying to do is show that they can flex their muscle. Attackers, cyber criminals, they definitely want their money, so they're going to do everything they can, and we've seen this in the past where they do establish help desk, they do negotiate the ransom, they do prove that they can decrypt the files. So this fits that pattern very well. Doesn't mean that it could be a new pattern or somebody's building on that pattern, but as of right now, that's what we know. And then there's the payment and decryption tools, which are done through Bitcoin, obviously. You can check the status of your payment all from one little handy screen, and you can even decrypt your files right from the screen once it's provided to you. Another thing that points to the fact that these guys were enterprising and attempting to really get as much money as they could off of this attack is the fact that they took time to translate the tool into 27 different languages. So, you don't really translate your tool into 27 different languages. Again, there's no need to do that. If you're just looking to flex muscle, you probably could go with English, and that's really well universally known, and you'd still get the same impact. When you're really looking for your 300 or 600 Bitcoin, you take the time to translate so that each and every user that gets this knows exactly how to make payment. So again, that's why we kind of take the stance that this was more of a cybercrime effort than a cyber espionage or cyber terrorism kind of move. So let's talk a little bit about shadow brokers and give you some feedback on what they are. So shadow brokers is a group that back in April dumped a set of tools from the NSA that was built at the NSA by a group called TAO. And the tool that they dumped is called Fuzzbench. Now, Fuzzbench is basically a set of tools written primarily in Python, C, and some assembler that allow you to execute attacks. Now, a lot of people have gotten up in arms about this in terms of, this is some advanced, sophisticated tool. And it is to some extent, but really what the tool does at the end of the day is just give you a friendly user interface. And by friendly, we're meaning friendly to developers and programmers, not friendly to an end user. The tool is freely available. Any of you can get a copy of it. It's not been removed from the internet or somehow blocked, so it's out there in the wild. One of the things within Fuzzbench, within this tool set that was dropped out there, is something called double pulsar. So double pulsar is just code. It's just somebody came up with that name. They probably enjoy astronomy. And what it is basically creates this covert channel that allows you to load executables, which is how this attack works. So when this attack works, it's executing this double pulsar code, which looks for SMB-based computers, and then establishes this covert channel, which is the network packet crafting, and lets you deploy your code on that machine that you've exploited, and then from there, the rest of everything I told you about, the task scheduler and all that stuff, executes from there. So that's all this tool really does. It is a powerful tool. I'll show you a little bit more about it and give you some more commentary on it. But that hopefully puts a little context on this, that yeah, it's a powerful tool, and it does make things easier, but it's not like there was some super secret squirrel stuff in this tool that attackers didn't know. It was just a matter of, did attackers really want to go after this and take time to do it. It does live in memory. We've covered that already. But one thing that you probably haven't heard in the media is that as of April 24th, there were some researchers looking into this tool when shadow brokers deployed this or set it free. And we found that there was about 65,000 computers that were already infected with double pulsar. Now, I want to take a moment to kind of let you know what that means. This is kind of why you got to be thinking about what are you doing with your internal networks. If double pulsar was deployed on your machine, then, on your internal networks, then it's already there. And even if you've blocked your external-facing machines, well, double pulsar is still internally on your machines, and that could be an issue for you. Now, there are some people working on ways to detect if double pulsar is on your machine or not, but it's just something you need to know about that. Before we ever saw the actual Friday attack, the NSA toolkit and this double pulsar code base was already being propagated. So, it's just something to keep in mind, something that you may want to think about, do you need to address within your own networks or not. This is the user interface for double pulsar, for the Fuzzbench product, and you'll see that just basically, you just launch it from a command line, Python space fb.py, load some plugins, and after that, you can go ahead and start playing with exploits. And so here it is. This is basically pinging for an IP address, and it's looking for exploits. You can just read from the top down. It's attempting different types of fingerprinting, and eventually you'll see at the bottom that it's installed the backdoor, and the external blue code succeeded in this instance. And then line right after that says FB special is actually a reverse command shell from whatever machine you attacked back to you, so that you can now start executing commands. In the case of the WannaCry application, it did basically this, and the only difference is that it scripted all the interaction versus established that reverse command shell back to an individual. If you want a headline for this, basically the headline would be that you have nation-state attack tools available to anyone. And we'll probably see the effect of this entire Fuzzbench product for several years to come. It takes a lot of the thinking out of how to craft these attacks and do them. And that's really the big change here, is that rather than have to really think about how you're going to do all this kind of stuff, the Fuzzbench makes it a lot simpler for you. And that's the long and short of it. So let's talk a little bit about threat mitigation. I'm hopeful that most of you will know this by now. I'm trying to add in some things that maybe you didn't think about and add some value for it, but just in case someone doesn't know, we're going to start with the basics. Basically, it comes down to three things that you need to do: patch, harden and educate, and test and validate. Patch obviously is deploying that SMB patch, and there's a special patch for Windows XP. So if you have XP devices, you should patch those. Microsoft has made a special patch available. As of yesterday, that website was getting clobbered, as you can imagine. So I'm not sure if it's still being clobbered. By clobbered, I mean people were trying to download the XP patch, and they just kept time out. So if you have had issues with it, keep revisiting it, and eventually you should get the XP patch. One thing that had also happened yesterday is there are other sites that are saying that they've loaded the XP patch and you can get it from them. I would really highly suggest that right now you don't go to any other site except Microsoft to get this patch. You may get some surprises. So hopefully be patient. If you need the XP patch, get it directly from Microsoft. At this point, you should have closed the ports that are listed here. These are the ports that we've found have come up over and over again as potential areas for compromise related to not just this attack, but others. If you are running SMB version 1, it should be disabled, and you should try utilizing SMB version 2 and 3, even though you put the patch in place. and obviously test that. You do need to advise your users, and for those in healthcare, which should be everybody on this phone, you should let your business associates know that they need to take these steps. And I'll revisit that in a moment, because this is an area that really always kind of falls through the cracks and gives people a big risk challenge. You want to review your file shares and make sure you have least privilege access in place in your networks. And again, you want to tell your business associates to implement these measures. Now, why do I keep harping on the business associates? It's because within HIPAA, you have a requirement that when there's a significant event, which this qualifies for, it'd be very hard for anyone to argue that this wasn't a significant event, you need to check with your business associates to understand if the data that you own, which is patient data, as a covered entity, has been compromised. And if not, you need to determine if that business associate still has in place or has put in place the appropriate safeguards given the change in the threat landscape. So it is extremely important that you do this because A, you need to protect that data, and B, if there is ever a breach of that data through the business associate, you're going to be asked, did you look into this? Did you deal with this during the significant event? And the outcome of that audit is going to be determined a lot by these actions. So if you do this, you need to document it and have it prepared in case you need to be audited. Second thing that comes from this is also your cyber liability insurance. Obviously, if they have special requirements for your partners or business associates, you want to make sure that you followed those as well. But at least from a HIPAA perspective, you need to do that. You obviously want to test your backup. One of the times when we talk to clients, they'll tell us, well, our next backup test is in 30 days. Given the challenges that this attack presents, you probably want to make sure things are going to be backed up and restored a lot sooner than 30 days out. Obviously, offline backups and disconnect from the network is very important. We know that ransomware can encrypt backups. We've seen that happen many times, especially last year with some of the attacks that we saw last year where backups were encrypted. So you need to get them, do the old-fashioned thing of putting them in a filing cabinet somewhere. Review your downtime and ransomware protocols and confirm your insurance requirements and coverages. We talked about that. That's a real important one, is make sure that that's in place, and if there's any special requirements from the cyber liability insurer for a situation like this. And keep in mind, this is something that's a point of confusion, that you have to patch unless you can demonstrate that there is no impact to patient safety. Now, many of you kind of say, well, the vendor will tell us that that's not certified on their machine, or it's not tested on them, so it avoids the warranty, or we were out of support. And that's all true, but unfortunately, sometimes life is difficult. And from a patient safety and patient privacy perspective and security, you have to patch. Ultimately, the patient's safety and the patient's privacy trump the warranty. So you probably don't want to go into a situation, an audit or something else, where your answer is, well, the warranty would have been out of support, because the response is going to be, so you knew there was a security risk, but you decided still not to do it because of the warranty. Probably not a good place to be. But as I told you in the beginning in the disclaimer, check with your internal controls, your auditors and lawyers, to see what their view is on that. All I can tell you is that the argument hasn't held up very well in previous incidents that we've been involved in. So just a heads up, you need to patch. And if you can demonstrate that patching would lead to a patient safety issue, document that so that you do have the ability then to say, we didn't do this not because of the warranty, but because this would have created a patient safety situation. So some additional threats, what I just gave you is the basics. Cybersecurity incident response plans, you need to really review them with a heavy focus on containment. We see a lot of plans people put in place that focus on response but don't really have anything in there for containment. And with these type of attacks, you really got to think about containment, especially if you have segregated networks or how you're going to stop the attack from spreading. Some cyber liability insurance organizations, if you can't demonstrate containment, actually don't pay out. So really think about that. Tabletop exercises are your friend. Test that plan. Review patch management and exception management. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of these, but one of the big ones is negotiating an air gap procedure. This is something that you can think about for the future, and that is speaking to your telecom provider about the ability that if you see attacks like this arising, we see the same thing occur and it's a much more nefarious attack. One of your strategies as a healthcare organization may be that you want to disconnect from the internet until you can understand what this attack is doing and give you a chance to prepare your countermeasures. It's a very valid strategy, but many healthcare organizations don't know how to do it or aren't prepared to do it. Now, obviously, it's not just as easy as just air gapping. You need to understand the impact on your systems and what disruption to operations may be. But it is an advanced strategy that you should really be thinking about if you have everything else in place, so that if we have these kind of massive, global attacks, you have a strategy that isolates you and allows you to continue and, again, get those countermeasures in place and then kind of come back up. We've talked about the business associate stuff. You should do some type of internal network traversal testing, some type of internal network pen testing to show how far could somebody get if they launched a a network traversal attack inside of your network. Could they really get to all of your data or not? And I would say, some of you are doing red team testing. You should do a red team assessment, which is a very rigorous assessment of your security. And then you want to definitely implement, if you can, continuous monitoring, continuous attack, and continuous diagnostics, which I'm not going to go into here, but happy to talk about at some other point. With that, so where do we see the threat going and the forecast on this? So real quick, we do believe there will be new variants of WannaCry. We have no reason to suspect that the kill switch will not be removed. We believe that there will be polymorphic attributes to it, which I won't go into here due to the complexity around it, but I'm happy if somebody wants to email me to talk about that a little more. But we think it'll be harder to stop. So those countermeasures and those advanced threat mitigation steps are really important. The thing to keep in mind, though, is whether WannaCry appears again or not, we do believe that there will be a lot of attacks that are attributed to this FuzzBench exploit toolkit. And today there's, I believe, I can't confirm this as of right now, that Shadow Brokers has actually released even more tools that they got from the NSA today. So, it's not just FuzzBench. There's a whole bunch of tools. There are promises that they're going to continue to dump tools to the internet for people to use. And so, if there's ever a time to really take stock of what is your countermeasures and how are you going to defend yourself, things have been rough last year for healthcare, obviously, in terms of cybersecurity. There's going to be no shortage of interesting attacks, we believe, in the next several months to a year. We do think, obviously, healthcare will become part of that fallout, but there's no credible indicators right now of a targeted attack against healthcare. Doesn't mean that it won't. I will tell you that one of the gentlemen I spoke with, Department of Homeland Security, is that they're kind of crossing their fingers that ultimately, if there is some type of attack, that people respect kind of the old Red Cross Geneva Conventions of not causing harm to patients. And so that's great. I hope that anybody that would attack us would keep that in mind, but it's probably not, in this day and age, something that we want to just hope that people have some form of integrity or honor when they're executing attacks. The big thing here, the biggest story I think that probably is maybe hopefully starting to get out there is that, it's not the cost of the ransom that matters. Some other organization said fine, we'll pay the $300, big deal. But I want you to step back and think about NHS and what happened to them. They canceled operations, they diverted people, they moved people out, they called in additional staff, shut down systems. The real issue here is not the actual ransom, it's the recovery. And the recovery is crazy amounts of money. Renault was attacked, the car maker. They had to shut down their factories. They let people go home. It's the actual response, the recovery to this that really makes it scary. And if you think about it, just patching your systems, not anybody on this phone, obviously, but if those people would have patched their systems, they wouldn't be dealing with this, right? So whatever the expenses related to kind of having the appropriate security in place up front is going to pale in comparison to the recovery operations that you're going to pay. And if you start thinking about like cyber liability and that there's gaps in that, or they may say you didn't contain this properly, or you know what, you should have had patches, because most cyber liability insurance assumes that your systems are up to date. Those safeguards may not be there for you. So with that, if you want to get a hold of me, that's my email. You can also get a hold of my associate, Mike Chirico. We're happy to answer questions or make this available to you in terms of a PDF or a deck if you need it. But if there are questions, I'm happy to take them at this time. Hopefully this was valuable to you and didn't just rehash everything that was out there. We try to take a lot of time and pride in putting this together and making sure it's accurate and timely and obviously valuable to you. So thank you very much for your attention. And not sure if there's any questions, but if there are, I'm happy to kind of work through them.
All right. Thanks, John. Now we would like to open it up to the audience for questions. As a reminder, please use the questions section in the GoToWebinar panel to submit your questions. It looks like we do have a couple here. The first one comes from James. Do Mac users have to worry about any issues from the NSA dump, or is it all Microsoft exploits?
Generally speaking, yes, Mac users need to worry. In fact, Apple today, deployed a ton of updates for Mac users across their entire product line that are all security focused. And a lot of that comes from what they're seeing in this fuzz bench. So although right now the attacks we've seen are specific to the Microsoft SMB platform, there's nothing in there that says it can't be against other users. And while we're at it, that includes Android. So, when you're thinking of what am I need to patch, where are my holes, it's the entire ecosystem of computing right now is challenged.
All right. The next question comes from Nail. The federal government is responsible for defense. That should include cyber defense. Is there anything that the feds/DoD can do to defend the entry points, the USA networks, rather than have each organization stand up a private militia to defend themselves?
That's an awesome question. Actually, it's part of an ongoing debate we have here at Sensado. We'd love to talk about this, and also the Second Amendment in terms of cyber weapons and should you be allowed to use them or not. So it's a fascinating debate. I'd love to talk about this at length. I'll give you the short answer. Several months ago, there was a botnet attack, and after that, there was actually a group brought together that was private-public, so federal government and cybersecurity researchers to discuss exactly what you're talking about. And the question became, should the FBI or DoD or someone have a switch that they can shut everything down? The big challenge has always been we don't know what that would mean in terms of the impact to individual systems and the crisis that could create. And there's always the economic factor. Is the cyber attack outweigh the economic benefit of shutting down the entire country's ability to conduct commerce? Would we be affecting things like airline transportation? Would we be affecting boats and ships? So it's a really complicated problem once you get into the weeds. It's a fascinating problem. And part of me says, yes, they should. And another part of me says, yeah, I get it. There's a lot else at stake here. That's why we think that this should be done at an individual organization level. If you have a switch at your healthcare organization that allows you to shut down the connection from the hospital to the internet, that's probably a good tactic, and you don't need to rely on DoD or whoever to do that. But it's a great question, and it's a great topic to kind of explore and talk about. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, excellent. And another question comes from Jim, and he wants to know, do you recommend that organizations have Bitcoins on hand in case they need to pay ransom?
Yeah, we've actually seen that. We've seen people hedging basically and keep some Bitcoins that they can buy cheaper. And then, in some cases, I don't know if I encourage this or not, right? I mean, I think it's a great thing from a financial strategy perspective. The CFO, it's not a bad thing to do. We've seen people actually make money, because once there's a ransom like this, Bitcoins get more expensive. And that's something I think people need to think about is if you're asked for 300 in Bitcoin, make sure you go out to Google and look at what that does when you convert the 300 Bitcoin to whatever currency you want. So yeah, it's a viable strategy. It's certainly something that should be considered. I don't see a harm in it if the organization can afford to do that. It's certainly something to do.
Okay, and one last question from James. Did this attack encrypt attached internet storage, Google Docs/Dropbox? You may have covered it, but it sounded like it only hit the files and folder local to the hard drive.
Yeah, so far we only know of instances that were local. We haven't seen that it actually got out to internet-based cloud storage systems. There's no reason it can't. I believe, I could be wrong, so hopefully don't quote me on this. I think it was either Box or Dropbox that had an incident months and months ago where some of their stuff got encrypted. But this attack, we didn't hear of anything that related to cloud-based storage.
Okay. Well, that was our last question. So this concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, John, for putting this together and presenting it to our readers so quickly. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.